Now it's time to implement Bootstrap version 3 into our Angular project. Now, of course, we mentioned in the last video, depending on how much of it you watched, we are going to be using Bootstrap version 3 because it is a public version. It's actually ready, it's already out there, and there's already so much stuff built for it. So that's why we're going to be sticking with Bootstrap 3. Even if you're watching this like a year or two from now, Bootstrap 3 is probably going to be still supported or probably still widely used. But I will say that Bootstrap 4 is almost out. It's almost like live. It's still in alpha, so it hasn't had an official release yet. But a lot of the concepts still overlap, right? So if you look in the documentation for Bootstrap 4, a lot of the concepts do overlap. But that's as it regards to Bootstrap. What we're going to be using for Bootstrap with respect to Angular is really just the CSS and also the HTML formatting, but really just the CSS. So the components, we're not even going to be using the Bootstrap components. Instead, we're going to be using Valor Software's NGX Bootstrap for the Angular widgets or components, specifically for Bootstrap 3 and 4. They do have documentation for 4, so it's probably very, very similar. And in fact, their Bootstrap 3 components are really easy to use and to work with. So that's something we're going to be doing in this one, is actually setting this up and working with it in our local project. Now, this is the first time we've actually worked with a third-party system that's not necessarily using just Angular. So this is a new install for us. So I'm going to go ahead and copy their installation. And we're going to go ahead and just do npm install ngx-bootstrap-save. Now the --save means that it's going to add it to my local system and save it to all the necessary dependencies such as package.json. So as that installs, I'm going to also then grab the Bootstrap CSS stuff. As it says, we need the Bootstrap 3 styles. Again, if we want a Bootstrap 4, we could use that stuff. But I'm going to be using Bootstrap 3 styles. So let's go ahead and grab that. Notice where it says index.html. So that means that we just go into our project and we're going to go in and jump into index.html. And I'm just going to paste in my index here or the CSS here. So that's going to change some stuff automatically. I will also mention that if you did follow me in the last one, we do have Bootstrap overview. We did keep that index file inside of the project just in case you wanted to take a look at it on our GitHub. So now that I've got that, let's go ahead and look at my project. And let's make sure the server is running with ng-serve, not ng-, but just ng-serve. And also notice that Bootstrap was installed. So it installed a couple things, Moment and ngx Bootstrap. And obviously notice the versions that I'm working in because that's what you may or may not have. But if you have a newer version, obviously go off of the documentation as to what they may say of changes. Okay, so automatically you might notice that some of the text stuff actually changed. So the actual format or the style of the text actually did change. So now it's time to implement some of the CSS into our project. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is jump into app component, and I'm actually going to add in a navbar here. So going into Bootstrap, we're going to go into components, and we're going to click on navs, or specifically navbar, and I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste their example. I'm going to bring it into my app component.html. I'll explain this in just a moment. I'll paste that in, save it, and in brand, I'll just type out serve up. And I'm also going to be using navbar inverse instead of navbar default. Notice my page is compiled fine. I go back into it, and there we go. So we actually have this navbar working. Now, if I break it down and try and click on any of these drop downs, or well, anywhere it says drop down, I try to click on those, it doesn't work. That we will come back to, of course. Another thing is I'm going to get rid of this container fluid. I don't actually want that right now. You might want to add it later, but I'm just going to bring it in to just the standard container, which brings all my content in a little bit. Okay, so why did I put it in app.component.html? Well, if you remember back, app.component.html is on every page because of this router outlet. This has to do with our routing. That has to do with everything here. If you didn't do routing in this way, you might not style your system the same way. So this router outlet I can actually put into its own div. So if I did div class equals to container, I totally could put it in here, and you probably would. So I save that and I refresh in here. Now it brings everything in nicely. I haven't done a whole lot, as you've noticed, but now it's already starting to look a little bit more like a real functioning web application, right? It's getting closer to it. It's not there yet, obviously, but it's getting closer to it. The next thing I will add is I'm just going to add an inline style sheet, and I'll say min height being to, let's say, 800 pixels. We'll save that, and I'll refresh in here. What that does is just on any page, then this minimum height for the content is 800 pixels, because if we go back into our components, I'm going to look for a footer, right? So panel with footer, that's not what I want. So let's actually go back into our regular CSS stuff, and I'll look for footer as well in here. And this is the same thing. It's not giving us the same footer that we might want. So going back into getting started, again, looking for footer. I see that there are some sticky footers here, so the things that actually stay on the bottom. Again, not necessarily something I want. So instead, I'll just add my own footer, and I'll just say serve up. And you could obviously add copyrights and all that stuff. And I scroll down here, I see that serve up's in there. So inside of this footer, I can add class of container, and we'll also add and ampersand copy. I believe that's how it works. And there we go. We've got our copy right there, and I'll just add text center, and I'll put an HR line or a line right above that footer class. Of course, we could add a bunch of other stuff, but now we have just a little footer, at least on every single page that we might go to. So if I go to item 1, notice that we have some minimum height in here. If I didn't have that minimum height, so if I cut this out, it would bring it right up, right above it. Okay, so what I want to do then, since I'm using CSS, I'll just do main container, and I'm going to cut this out. So my main container, I will copy this, bring it into my global styles main container, and I'll say minimum height equals to 800 pixels, and I'll also say margin bottom, and we'll add 20 pixels. We save that, refresh, and there we go. So now it's back, and it's actually giving us the necessary things. Okay, great. So that's a good start, but well, I want to get these drop downs working, right? So they're not actually working right now, and if I click on it, it actually takes me to a link. So to get these drop downs working, I go back into Valor Software's documentation for NGX Bootstrap. I click on drop downs, and I scroll down. It gives me some usage. Really straightforward. I'm going to go ahead and import this. This is in our app module. Notice it says app module. So I'm going to go in app module, and I'm going to do some imports. I'm going to put my third-party imports here. So third-party imports right there. So I've got my BS dropdown module actually here. And then it says to put it into my imports. And I'm just going to go off of what they say. So down here, imports. I'm just going to put it right there. BS module dropdown for root. Scroll down a little bit. Notice the drop-down items here. So these attributes are directives. This is what they're called. We haven't really covered directives yet, but basically it means that I can add my own attribute on to any sort of div, and then it will work. So if I grab this, and let's go back into app component to any of those drop-downs. So we've got our drop-down here, right? So the drop-down class itself is where we put that drop-down, just like it says here. Well, in this case, it's button group, right? So this is actually where the button group is. So this is the button. And then I can add the button, the actual button, and do drop-down toggle. So drop-down toggle, notice the class is, we just add drop-down toggle there. And then if we scroll down to the UL class where the actual drop-down is, this is the drop-down menu. Notice the class, and we paste this in. Looks very similar. This time it has a star in front of it. So these are all working in conjunction with each other. and we go back in, we refresh. I click on this drop down. Oh, it works. The other one does not. So same thing. Let's just do it again so you can see it in action. But this time I'm not going to reference the docs. Instead, I'm going to go off of the classes drop down, and then this class drop down toggle, and then finally star drop down menu, save it, refresh, and there we go. Drop down toggle is working. I scroll this and that toggle is not working. So let's see, for instance, if we can get that toggle actually working. And here is the collapse portion. So this is slightly different. I might have to come back to that, and I actually will. So for now, I'm going to actually comment that out. So I'm going to get rid of that entire button. So when it breaks down, it collapses and that button's not even there. So that means that my navigation might have to change slightly, but there are ways around this, which I'm not going to cover just yet. Okay, so that's one portion of it. We've got drop downs now. But what if I wanted to add a carousel? So like on the main page, what if I wanted some images loaded here? So that means that on video list, because that's our initial component, right? So if we go back into our routing, we see that that is actually our initial component. That's not what I want to do. So in the next one, we'll actually add in the carousel, and then we'll also have a new home-like page for all this stuff. If you have any questions on what we did here, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going.